Thank you so much, everyone, for being here online to attend this very special event. Over 500 people RSVP'd for this event, which is a record for us, the Genre Committee. You've had a very unusual year, and we hopefully will be, next year, we'll be back at 3rd and Fairfax at the Writers Guild and doing this live. But my name is Dwayne Johnson Cochran, the chairman of the Genre Committee. I would like to introduce Kelly Jo Brick, Vice Chair of the Genre Committee. And Kelly's going to tell us a little bit about some events coming up 2021.
Hey, everybody. Thanks also for coming out tonight. The Genre Committee, anyone who would like to come out and join us, we'd love to have you join in our meetings. We meet every other month. Our next meeting will be in February, but we have some really cool events coming up. We're doing a panel early next year on sports movies and how that affects genre and how that can tell so many stories. Also young adult, animation, and genre comedies. So we have a lot of great ideas in the mix, and we're working on some other ideas for hopefully when we can all be back together, like Dwayne said, in the building. So come join us. We'd love to have you be part of the Genre Committee. And back to Dwayne.
Right now, I'm very proud to welcome Ronald D. and Damon Lindelof in our series called Conversations in Genre. Moderating this event is Genre Committee member Phil Pirrello. We thank you so much for being here, and take it away, Phil.
Thanks, Dwayne. Again, my name is Phil Pirrello. This panel, it's obviously a highlight and otherwise dismal year, so we appreciate everyone taking the time to join us tonight. And a big thanks to Greg and Libby and the rest of the WGA staff for helping pull this together. For this panel, we're just going to be talking about the sci-fi genre landscape in general with two writers who have found significant success within it, and hear about their process and their experiences, and hopefully it'll help us with some of our own. It's not often you get to talk to two writers who inspired you to become one yourself, so before this becomes a Chris Farley show sketch on SNL, I'm just going to introduce the panelists. After co-creating Lost, he helped bring us such shows as Leftovers, the movie Star Trek Into Darkness, and HBO's Emmy-winning Watchmen. Please welcome Damon Lindelof. Damon, thanks for joining us, man.
Thanks so much for having me.
And joining him is a writer who worked on both Star Trek: The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, as well as 2 Star Trek feature films. Also, Battlestar Galactica, Outlander, and Apple TV's For All Mankind, which just today got an early season 3 renewal, which is pretty cool. Please welcome Ron Moore.
Hi, glad to be here. Thank you.
Thanks again for joining us, guys. And just real quick, I'm just curious, like, what was the first thing you remember watching of each other's work, and what really stuck out for you?
For me, it definitely it would have probably. I mean, I know Ron wrote a lot of Next Generation, which my parents got divorced when I was 11 years old, and on the East Coast, I don't know, it was syndicated, so it was on Saturdays. Next Generation was on Saturdays, so I'd watch it with my dad, and we'd watch it live with commercials. It was on like Channel 13, UPN, I think it was called at the time. So I think Ron, did you come on in the 3rd season, the 4th season?
Third season.
So, like, for all good things is the first episode where I was like, who's that? Because it was the finale, and obviously that was many years later, but it was such an incredible episode, and I watched it a dozen times. And so I think that's probably the first time that I was aware of a writer named Ron Moore. But we didn't have constructs for like what a showrunner was or what an executive producer was, but I did understand who writers were. And so that was probably my initiation.
The first thing I saw of Damon's was the pilot to Lost, which I didn't see on air. Like it was broadcast in that period. The Battlestar miniseries had been on, and we were working on the series, and the series hadn't premiered yet, and it was sort of this interim time. And I watched it because like every working writer, you're doing a show, but you're also sort of developing constantly on the side, and you're still pitching. So I was out pitching other pilots with my producing partner, and we were pitching some shows, and people kept saying, well, could this be more like Lost? Which I hadn't seen yet. And everyone was talking about it, and and it was starting to piss me off. And everyone was like, no, we want to do our own Lost. We want a show like Lost. And so I was like, I had my agent send me the pilot, and I put it in with this real kind of chip on my shoulder, like, what the is this? And I put it in, and I was legitimately pretty blown away. I was like, wow, this is really different. I had never seen anything like it, because just from that opening frame, and you're just on this guy's face, and then he's looking up, and then wander out to the beach, and the plane crash, and the characters, and you're just like stepping in mid-story. And it was a clear serial at a time when doing serialized television was really unusual, especially on broadcast TV. And I literally never seen anything like it. And so when it was over, I was impressed and even more pissed off, because now it's like the bar was even more high, was even higher, and I was like, oh shit, this is like the new level of television that you've got to like speak to, and who wrote this thing, and that's how, this is the first time I was aware of Damon.
I have to say this, and Phil, I apologize if you're going to tee this up, but because part of me was hoping that Ron was going to say Nash Bridges, because that would have been the coolest thing. But
that would, okay, the deep cut.
Go with the obvious, but it's so crazy because, and I'm not saying this out of humility or modesty. Anyone who knows me knows that I rarely exhibit either of those things. But that show would not exist if it weren't for Next Generation. Like, I really do believe, like, particularly the episodic structure of Next Generation and the way that it did mysteries, and then could vacillate so deftly between, sort of seasonal arcs or finales into premieres. Just like there were ongoing constructs like the Borg or Q, that floated in and out. But then the ability for any one episode to just be about something strange is going on. We don't know what it is. We have to figure it out. And the answer is always very intimate. It's very emotional and character-based. It was very internal versus very external. I really felt like that was a model, that was essential in figuring out. So I just find it sort of like either awesome / ridiculous that someone was saying to you, can it be more like Lost? Where it's like, Lost is like Next Generation and Deep Space Nine and Voyager, just like, but I think like when people talk about Trek, and I'm sure we will at some point later, like the mystery element of the show that you gamed for is so, those episodes still really hold up. So thank you.
Sure.
Yeah.
Damon, I think you had said that All Good Things kind of inspired some of the structure and writing of The Constant, right? Can you talk about your process with that?
Well, I think inspired is a very polite way of saying like we ripped it off. I mean, I think that All Good Things and Slaughterhouse-Five are the two sort of like primary inspirations for like dramatic. I like time travel stories where the consciousness is traveling, but you don't physically actually get into a time machine. And so because we all have this fantasy, or at least we all, like sometimes I say we all do this thing and people are like, you're weird. But like we all have this fantasy of like, it's the Peggy Sue Got Married version of time travel versus the Back to the Future version, where just my 47-year-old brain drops into 17-year-old Damon, and like I have hair and I can run fast and my body doesn't hurt when I wake up in the morning and all of that stuff. And so I think All Good Things, which I can't adequately summarize, but Jean-Luc Picard is basically hopping between 3 different time periods, but just as consciousness. And so he's aware that this is happening, but nobody else is. And then there's a massive emotional component to all of it underlying that. And so when we were designing The Constant, which is one of the, Carlton and I wrote it, but it took the writer's room 6 weeks to break it. And we were still doing, that was in season 4, I guess. So I think maybe we did 15 episodes that year, but because of the strike, but that was 6 weeks that we didn't have. But when you're doing non-paradoxical time travel, where things that your consciousness travels back from the future, but you can't do anything in the past that affects or creates paradox. And in that case, in All Good Things, which was the finale of the entire series, by the way, there's an anomaly that they're dealing with that sort of is, exists like at the dawn of time, et cetera, et cetera. But again, it all felt like super intimate. And so intimacy was the watchword. And then we were like, can we do this as a love story where it's basically like a character is seeking to anchor himself because the needle is skipping through time. And how do we explain the rules of this? We need our Doc Brown character that ended up being Faraday, but like, how do we focus on all of that stuff? And we just kept referring back to, there's another exec producer, writer, Liz Sarnoff, who was a huger Next Generation fan than I was, which is saying something. And like between the two of us, we were constantly like, we can't totally rip it off, but it was definitely, you can't have one without the other. It's the chicken and the egg.
As Picard says.
Yes. We ripped that off in Watchmen too.
Oh, that's awesome. I think Ron might be entitled to some royalties here, maybe? I don't know.
Yeah, have the arbitration.
My agent will be in contact. Yeah, exactly.
Well, since we're talking about Trek, and since both of you have worked on Trek, I'm wondering, like, what's a discovery you made while working on that property that maybe changed your writing process or helped you in the future break the logjam on another project?
Well, I mean, for me, it was my entire education into the professions. It was, I got my undergrad at Next Gen, and my graduate work was at Deep Space Nine. I mean, it taught me everything about being a professional writer and television production. So it was just one big education. That's because I sold my first script there. It was my first staff job, producer. It was there for 10 years, and it taught me everything. I do remember a specific occasion where early on I think it was my second year, I was struggling with a script. It was one of the Klingon scripts that I did, and Michael Piller, the late Michael Piller, who was the showrunner of Next Gen, was giving me notes, and there was this one scene with like it was like Lursa and B'Etor, the two female Klingon sisters, and Picard. And are you guys still there? Everything just froze on my end.
I'm still here.
I thought you were asking that
Still
because
there?
you started talking about Klingons.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm all the way here.
Okay. My screen's frozen, but I can still hear all of you.
Okay.
And essentially, I was struggling with making the scene work. And Michael said, "Okay, I want you to write this scene. I'm going to give you a scene I did for Simon and Simon." To which I kind of blanched and went, "What?" He said, "This will teach you. It's like, I want these two characters to be going at Picard from different aspects and trying to get information out of him, and you'll get it. Just read the scene, you'll see." And I took the scene upstairs, and I was like, "What is this? Simon and Simon, really?" And I read this scene, and it was like a light bulb went off, because I understood there was a structure to this scene. He had the two brothers were interrogating some guy for some unknown reason, but one of them was playing it for comedy, and the other one was kind of doing it for threat. And there was an underlying thing going on as like a backbeat during the whole scene. There was about, I think it was about a woman that that the two guys had dated or were interested in, or some such thing. And there was this sort of banter that was going between the two of them, in addition to them trying to get information out of the guy caught in the middle. And as I read it, I just sort of realized scene structure. And I was like, oh, not just like trying to get the information out, and not just sort of talking about Picard's character or whatever, and all the things that I was still dealing with on a very kind of top level or superficial level. I understood that there was an interior structure to scenes for the first time. And it was really like, it changed the whole process. And I suddenly started approaching scenes very differently. And it was just very ironic that it was like a piece of Simon and Simon that it was just some broadcast TV show that I didn't think very much of, but there was actual, there was actual craftsmanship in there. And I took that lesson on it and always sort of tried to hear the backbeat of scenes and try to understand scene structure after that point.
Oh, do we lose him? I guess we're just talking to ourselves.
I guess it's just us.
I just love the idea that that like there is like an in case of emergency break glass, and there's just a Simon and Simon scene in there.
There's a Simon and Simon scene.
Have you ever done that to another writer? Have you ever given them something you've written as like a teaching mechanism?
I've never done that. I've always felt the audacity, it's a pretty ballsy move, and I couldn't do that. It's like I'll note people, I'll give them the notes, I'll even like give them a version of the scene that I think is better, but I don't think I've ever given out a sample of my own.
It's like a real Robert McKee move, right? Which is like, like I'm giving you my book.
It is. Here's
by the way,
book.
Robert McKee, just so that an adaptation could exist is well worth it. I actually took Robert McKee.
I was going to ask you that if you had done that.
We all did. I mean, like, we all did. It's. I feel like we all did. It was sort of like if you came out here in the early '90s and you wanted to be a writer, you did it. Like, I
stayed away from. I didn't, and I was always. I didn't take screenwriting classes or writing classes really in college or anything. I had always written growing up as a kid, and I didn't take it seriously as a job until I had nothing else in life. I was like, maybe I'll be a writer. But once I started writing, I was really afraid to take classes or seminars like that because I thought once I get that in my head that this is supposed to be the process, it'll never leave, and I'll always be trapped in the, oh, wait a minute, the hero is supposed to so-and-so by page 5. And so, I don't even know what the classes are, what it's like. So I was always just kind of scared of it. And edge, oh no, I don't know how this works in my head, and I'm kind of afraid to mess with it. So I never learned any of the techniques or really even the theory of it.
That's so interesting because I went to film school at NYU, which was a great experience, but the whole sort of raison d'etre and like philosophy at the school was ignore structure, like don't don't do that thing, like. Mean Streets has no, heroic structure to it. It's just true, authentic art. And I was like, yeah, that's awesome. And then suddenly I found myself in a mailroom in Los Angeles, and there was a spec market, and it was sort of like, oh, they want Die Hard on a Navy ship. Like that's what, and I've watched these movies all my life, but I have a film degree, and we didn't do any of that, like that level of deconstruction. So I started to kind of panic a little bit, where I was like, I think I was trained to be an artist, and now suddenly I'm they call this thing the industry, which is not a word that I heard for the, you shouldn't be able to get a degree from NYU if you've never heard the phrase the film industry, or at least I ignored it. But it's like industry, you kind of like, it's like you've got like Fritz Lang's Metropolis sort of in you.
Yeah, there's a factory in this.
Yeah, it really did, but that's what it was like. So suddenly, like this idea of like, oh, they're not making magic out there; they're making widgets. That can't be true. And then sort of wrangling all of that was so. Yeah, I took McKee, and coming out of it, I was basically like, this is a scam, right? Like this is
really.
This is garbage. I mean, there's not this. This isn't to take anything away from Robert McKee, but it's like there's nothing that I learned in that class that wasn't better taught in Adventures in the Screen Trade, the Golden.
Really?
But oh yeah, I mean, like I don't think so. And sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just I picked up everything from just kind of because I was a TV kid and I loved television growing up, and I watched it obsessively, and I think I just sort of drank in the idea of structures and what act breaks were without even knowing it was called an act break. That before you went to a commercial, something dramatic had to happen. and that that there was this little thing that happened before the main title played that was kind of exciting, and a lot of just sort of structural things came out of television. Like film seemed like just a long TV episode to me, because TV was my primary form, and most films I saw were on broadcast television with commercial breaks. So even that was like, oh, there's a 2-hour episode in my head. Is kind of how things were structured, and I picked up. Yeah, it's a 2-hour thing. Yeah. So I just, everything I knew about writing, and I would write short stories on my own, and little stories about Star Trek primarily, or Lost in Space, or Mannix, or $6 Million Man, or things I was obsessed with watching. But it was usually imitative. I was trying to imitate what they did, and about how long the scenes were, and how much action. I just tried to get as close to the episodes that I was watching as I could replicate, just on in my notebook.
You're telling me there's Ron Moore fanfic out there?
There is Ron Moore fanfic that is, I am sure, still in my mother's house to this day, because she preserved all that stuff. Oh, she preserved all that stuff.
That's awesome. Thanks for taking over, guys. Sorry about that. Snowstorm here is being a dick with our power.
So you're in Pennsylvania right now?
I'm in Pennsylvania, yeah, Erie, PA.
Excellent.
It's fun with the weather. And I'm bummed I missed that great Simon and Simon Lursen Bator story. The Star Trek nerd in me is really upset.
You can watch it on the
yeah, it's recorded.
Yeah, great. So I guess since you guys have both worked on significant IP throughout your careers, what lessons have you learned about how to satisfy, creatively what you want to do, and also protect the integrity of these iconic properties? It has to be a tough tightrope.
Do you want to dive in there first, Ron?
Sure. I mean, for me, again, my first experience being at Trek, it was all kind of discovering what it was and how far you could go. And as a fan of the material, I knew a lot about Trek history and the Kirk and Spock era, and the roots of the Federation. All that kind of stuff was just, I knew it backwards and forwards. But at the moment that I joined Trek, that was almost like a black mark against you. Like, they didn't really want fandom within the show. They didn't. If you were a fan of the show, they kind of, what? You're one of those fans. And so I had to kind of hide all that, right? So I learned kind of quickly not to let that stuff rise to the surface. And it was also valuable in that it taught me not to let that take over. I had to learn about character and story structure and how to write a producible script and all the nuts and bolts and basic things that I still had to learn. And then along the way, I figured out little ways to creep in things of fandom. And then once I got more comfortable, it was, okay, now how far can we push what Star Trek is? Star Trek then had sort of clear borders of what they wanted Trek to be and what they did not want Trek to be. And I was interested in finding, where were the places I could push the border out a little further? How ambiguous could this week's story be? Could Picard make the wrong decision? Could the Federation be wrong? What are the limits in terms of, everything, graphic content, and trying to just discover the boundaries. And every time I found a boundary, I would then try to push it again to see how flexible the format was. And when we were at Deep Space Nine, the whole writer's room was dedicated to the idea of, let's figure out how far we can push Trek as a concept. There's no ship. You're not boldly going anywhere. It's more serialized. We're going to have a war. Let's just really see what we can do. And we found out what the limitations were, but it was just, I guess I was always interested in seeing how far you could stretch it, as opposed to sort of saying, well, those are the limits and I have to play within the sandbox over here.
Please tell me at some point in the writer's room, someone said, "You're not boldly going anywhere." Could have snapped at you and said, "Oh, mister, you're not.
Thou shalt not boldly go to that place." Anywhere.
Deep Space Nine boldly stays. I mean, I think that we use this phrase IP, and this goes back to, I went on a sort of a rather long-winded diatribe on the word industry, but intellectual property is under the same sort of it takes all the fun out of it, right? Like the idea that anything that is intellectual can be property. And I understand we have to protect ideas and Otherwise it'll be a free for all. But at the same time, the way that I kind of look at story is a bit romantic. And so this idea of like, especially when you're myth making, and when you look at, I'm not an anthropologist, but one of the things that's always amazed me about story is that all of these cultures that started developing, the ones that we know first developed systems of writing, they weren't in any contact with one another, but they developed very similar myths around creation, and their understanding of the way that the world worked before sort of science and the printing press came in, where you could really share ideas across continents. And so that makes me kind of feel like we're all like, there is a story that we're all kind of collectively telling, and we just have, our job is to kind of find more inventive ways to tell it, to disguise it slightly. But it gets into this area of like, people want things to be very familiar and they want things to be very new. And that's a paradox. It's very challenging. And when we put that same idea into the kind of language that Ron and I are constantly faced with, is like, it starts to take on the valence of fan service.
Right.
So, which everyone sort of universally agrees now is a bad thing. But when I was growing up in the 80s, that's what you were striving for, fan service. This sort of idea of like, it's a band taking the stage and they play a song that only the people who heard that demo that was circulate. It's like you have an inside knowledge. So when a character drops a name, you know it. So like Mandalorian does this, I think, beautifully, where the fan service doesn't get in the way of understanding the arc of the story, but clearly it's being made by people who understand, like Dave Filoni, who worked on Clone Wars, and now he's referencing things that happen in the Star Wars novelizations, where you kind of go like, I feel that's just for me. And that's a beautiful thing. And so when fan service becomes toxic, it's when it's so inside baseball. I know I'm mixing metaphors right now, but it's like that you can't really understand it, or you feel like it's not for you, or that you're being left out. There's like a velvet rope that you have to stand behind. And I think it's so interesting for Ron to say that when he was working on Next Gen, the idea was you have to hide your fandom. Whereas, and Alex Kurtzman and I are very good friends, but I don't ask him a lot about what's happening on Discovery or Picard, because I just want to watch the show and I don't want to know how the sausage is made. But I get the sense that almost the entire staff is fans, and it feels that way. Like there's probably different levels of fandom. And when I was curating the Watchmen writers' room, I wanted to make sure that there were super fans in the room and also people who were just coming to Watchmen, but you kind of had to love Watchmen as a criteria. Like you didn't want to have anybody in the room who's like, this is garbage, like that to me. And so, again, with the romantic, you have to love it. If you don't love it, you're not qualified to write it, I think. Like, right. Isn't that sort of intuitive? I don't know.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, it's similar when we did Outlander. I built the room with people that loved the books and people who had never read the books, but they had to have read it and then love the material. And then so part of the conversation in that room was always about adaptation and how we're going to adapt this book to television. And that argument is always about, well, what's important to keep and what's okay to change. And you had to have the people that love the book, that had drank it in and were like, oh my God, you can't lose that scene, versus the people that were like, yeah, that was an okay scene, but it's not really that important to the story because I was more interested in this. And the argument, the balance of the two of them would ultimately lead us to the way that we could kind of satisfy both audiences, ideally.
Yeah, right. I mean, you can love it, but you can challenge it. I mean, that's part of fandom too. And like, it's been an evolution for me, by the way, because I identified as a fan and still identify as a fan, even though I'm making this stuff now professionally, but that's how I see myself first. Right. I'm much more comfortable in the line for Hall H than I am on the stage at Hall H. That's just true. But the reality is that, like, I used to think that if you were super critical of something, then your fan like your fan ID card could be revoked. So if someone was like bashing on Lost, I would be like, you're not a fan. And then Emily Nussbaum, who is an incredible critic for the New Yorker at the time, she just wrote like an epic takedown of me trying to revoke fan credentials from people who are being critical of Lost. And I had the same experience, you know, of like sort of reading it with my arms crossed and then at the end of it being completely and totally convinced, because there are things that we love. You know, you and I were just talking about Temple of Doom, you know, where it's sort of like we're allowed to say that Raiders of the Lost Ark is a perfect movie and Temple of Doom is not. And we can still love Indiana Jones.
We can say that.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
We can still watch it years later.
You said it, Ron. I didn't say it.
I
said it.
it.
Yeah,
That's right. I'll own that.
I agreed.
Well, you know, and I remember there was this. I remember years ago reading a review online of at the beginning of the internet when we were still doing when we were doing Next Gen, and there was this site, I think it was on TrekWeb, which is now defunct, but somebody was writing a review of an episode that I'd written or at least involved with. I don't remember which one it was, but the opening line I've quoted ever since, which was, "I've watched this episode 4 times and it gets worse every time I watch it." And I was like, that is a fan. That she loves this material, loves it. Because how can you watch it 4 times if you hated it? You know, no matter what you say at that point, you are a fan. And there's a part of fandom that expresses its love through criticism, through takedown, through like hate, and you know, that's part of the process too.
And it's also like, because Ron, you were talking about, you know, that tendency in Next Gen to rein back on those needle drops or Easter eggs. And Damon brought up how Mandalorian seems to like embrace them. Like, since you both worked on very popular franchises that have a lot of eyes over it, it's almost as if you're writing them with them over your shoulder, the fans over your shoulder in real time. Like, how do you guys like negotiate like the stress of that and trying to appease just the job in front of you?
I work very hard to not even think about it, and I'm kind of the person who's always, you know, people in the writers' room. I get really cross with people who say, "Oh, you know, I was reading online and the fans didn't like that episode last night, what they said on Twitter," and I'm like, I don't really care. That's not what we're about in here. This isn't a democracy. We're not voting on it. Our job is to do the best show that we can do every single day, and you hope people like it. You know, you hope that the audience responds. But you can't get caught up in that. It's like, I just think you go down that rabbit hole and you start reading all the criticism, and I've done it. I'm not above it. It's like something new of mine comes out or a new show. I'll read the reviews and like, you know, I'll start reading all the negative reviews, and the good ones are like, yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one. Oh, here's a really bad one, and read the whole thing. And it's just a toxic way. It's bad. And I try really hard to not let that come into the writer's room or into the production. It's just try to keep all that outside. Guys, that's not what we're about. What's the best show we think we can do? What's the best scene we think we can write? What is the best edit? And it's just try to trust in that judgment and then put it out there for the public.
Yeah, and I agree with everything that Ron just said, and I also think that, you know, the fandom is not a monolith. You know, I mean, I think that the idea of you know, what is a Star Trek fan? Some people are really into the original series. Some people are into Next Gen. Some people, their favorite show is Voyager. Some people, you know, like they have stuff that they love and they have stuff that they hate, but there's not this kind of like universal sense of like, this is what the fandom says or this is what the fandom doesn't say. And when you take something like Outlander, where it's basically like you're inheriting a huge and passionate fan base from a book. And they've cast it in their head. You know, it's sort of like, it looks a certain way, it feels a certain way. And it's Ron and his incredible, you know, production teams and the writer's job to basically say, like, we have to manifest this to the best of our ability. And now you create an entirely new fandom just around the show, that maybe many people haven't read the books. I mean, I'm no statistician, but I would imagine that many more people have seen the show Outlander than have read the books. And I know that's the case for Game of Thrones. where that is an immensely popular book series, but for every one person who's read the book, there's probably 50 or 100 people who have seen the show. And so you have to just basically write the best version of the show that you can. That said, I do have this ridiculous idea that it's possible to write something that everyone will love. Like that's kind of what we're chasing. It's like Charlie Brown has to believe that Lucy's not going to pull it away this time. That's why he keeps going after it. And Wile E. Coyote has to believe that he's going to get the Roadrunner. Like it's just like that there is nobility in the ridiculousness of the mission to basically please everyone. And God forbid I actually achieved a moment where there was universal embrace for anything that I wrote, because then I'd be like, what now? Like you can't, like what would Charlie Brown do if he kicked that football? Like, it's just like the sort of sense of emptiness on the other side of it would be so overwhelming. So there's a part of me that needs Robert Duvall in the stands, in the Natural, to basically like hate me, no matter what I do, he's going to hate Roy Hobbs. Like, and that's like, there's something like, if you have to kind of like push back against fandom, and they like that dance. There is a bit of like, when I used to see like Kevin Smith down at Comic-Con, there was this sort of like, I'm Andy Kaufman and I'm heckling you motherfuckers. That was like, sort of like, I was in awe. I was like, oh my God, like, what is he doing? Like all these people waited online 4 hours to have Kevin Smith call them pieces of shit. They loved it. It was amazing.
They loved it. They'd line up. They'd be a bigger crowd the next time he did it.
Absolutely.
Crazy. Well, I'm wondering, Damon, since you've worked on Trek and Alien, there seems to be a sniper scope on your stuff when you're tackling that stuff. And did you encounter the pressure working on those that Ron encountered on his stuff, which is like dial back on the fandom or go full throttle with it?
I mean, certainly that was the case on Prometheus, which was, part of it is when like Ridley, we had finished Lost. All I had really worked on was Lost for almost 7 years. And then the first Trek movie, I produced, and we worked as a kind of writing collective, although Bob Orsi and Alex Kurtzman wrote that screenplay top to bottom. JJ and I and Brian Burke were all there sort of collectively making that movie. But that was all I did was those 121 episodes and the Trek movie. And so the first call I got after Lost ended was like Ridley Scott called me on my cell phone. And I was, my agent had given me like a 3-minute long heads up. He was like, Ridley Scott is calling you. I gave him your number. I hope that's okay. And I was like, what? And I was driving on Ventura Boulevard in Studio City. I just pulled my car over, and then it rang. It was like a blocked number, and I answered it. And I was like, hello? And he just started talking, because when you're Ridley Scott, you don't say like, hey, is this Damon? I'm Ridley. Like, he just was like, he was just like, you know who I am, which, by the way, is a relief, because it's always weird when celebrities are like, hi, I'm Tom. Oh, thanks, Tom Cruise. Oh, nice to meet you. So, like, Ridley, he was like, I'm sending you a script. Let me know what you think. And then they sent over this script that was called Alien Zero at the time, that was written by John Spates. And I thought it was really, really good. And I was like, why are they sending this to me? And unfortunately, there's a culture in movies, in our business, where you do not collaborate. If a writer, like, they hire a writer, the writer does their passes, and then they are replaced for reasons still unknown to me after a decade or a decade plus of movie writing. Where, like, that's just not the way. That's not the ideal way that it should work. But I understand it's an imperfect system. So I'm sort of like, the mission here is for me to guess why they aren't letting John Spates continue on this movie, they must. It's not because it's not well written, because it's very well written. It must be because they want to take it in a different direction. So, and Ridley Scott doesn't want me to be Chris Farley going like, remember in Blade Runner, remember when Roy Batty is on the roof and it's raining and he's talking to and like, he doesn't want to hear any of that shit.
No.
Ridley Scott wants me to treat him like he's just a normal, like he's my boss, and I can't geek out at all. But at the same time, I'm sitting across a table from him, and it's Ridley Scott. I mean, and so that part of it is performative, right? Because you do want to just be super nerdy and like, but you're in a professional scenario. So, like, I realized that he didn't want to make an Alien prequel. He wanted to make a movie that took place before the events of Alien, but wasn't as reliant on the face huggers and chest bursters, and he was much more interested in this creation myth, the Promethean myth, the idea of like mankind finding, like going and asking God, why did you make me, and why have you forsaken me, and and all of that stuff. And so versus when Ron and I are showrunners, we're getting pitched, we're getting like we're in this scenario in movies, I'm trying to help Ridley find what it is he wants, even though he's not entirely sure what he wants yet. And then that's the job, and I take full responsibility for the screenplay that I wrote, but the job is, what does Ridley want to do? And I'm going to do that. And so there was a scene in Prometheus where they first encounter some nasty critters and they take their helmets off. And I was like, dude, they can't take their helmets off. They can't like approach these critters like they're not dangerous. They've seen Alien. And Ridley was like, what do you mean? And I was like, they've seen the movie Alien. He said, this takes place before Alien. I said, I'm talking about the fans, like John Hurt could look in an egg and you don't think he's a moron because Alien hasn't happened yet. He's in the movie Alien. But now, even though this is chronologically happening before those events, the fandom is going to go, you idiot. It's not the same as going up into the attic when you hear a loud noise. And he kind of looked at me like I was a crazy person. And that was the moment where I had to like really hide my fandom, where I was like, okay, their helmets are off. Got it. Copy that.
It's funny you brought that up because there was a tweet going around today that everyone mocked that scene in Prometheus until you realized gestures to world right now, how people are going out in the middle of a pandemic. So.
Oh yeah, they're maskless. That's right. Yeah.
Right.
It's great to know that they're still mocking Prometheus all these years later.
Yeah, I'm glad they've let that go.
Fantastic.
Can I tell my Ridley Scott story real quick?
Please.
So I'm doing a Battlestar or Caprica. It was like right in that time, and my agent calls and says, "We got a call from Ridley Scott and wanted to see if you would meet with him because he's going to do an adaptation of his book." And I was like, "Oh my God, that'd be amazing! What book?" They said, "The Forever War." And I went, "Oh, wow. I just read a review of that in the New York Times. That's really interesting. Let me get the book and I'll read it as soon as I can." And of course, it takes me too long to get the book and read it. And it was by Dexter Filkins, who was a New York Times correspondent, who had done this book about the Iraq and war in Afghanistan. It was really interesting reporting. It's kind of very non-linear, kind of bouncing back and forth to different people he had met in his travels as a journalist. And I was like, wow, Ridley's going to do this. This is going to be one of the seminal works of the war on terror. And holy crap, this is amazing. And I call back. And by the time I call back and would make the appointment, they'd already give the assignment to another writer. But Ridley wants to meet anyway and just have a general meeting. So I'm like, oh shit, missed. But I'll go and I sit down in the general meeting. And he's a fascinating guy, and I'm sitting there and it's really like, wow, I'm meeting with Ridley Scott, man. This is like so cool. And at some point in the conversation, I say, it's too bad that I missed on. I'm sorry I missed on Forever War, but really hope that you are excited to do it. He's like, oh yeah, I've loved that book since I first read it in the 1970s. And the whole room, like, it was one of those scenes where you do the pull and zoom out kind of thing, where I realized I had read the wrong book. This wasn't even There was another book, I think it's by Joe Haldeman, a famous sci-fi work, come to find, called The Forever War. They really
Oh my
did
God.
an adaptation of, and I didn't hear anything else he said for like the next 10 minutes because I was so like frozen, mortified about, oh my God, I could have had this meeting to come in here and talk about,
That's
how
amazing.
my
Oh,
ideas
no.
for the.
Wow. That's a great Ridley story.
Great
Yeah.
story. Back to talking about IP. Damon, you had mentioned you were talking about IP and the struggles therein. We just recently did a panel about trying to sell original sci-fi in a marketplace that is seemingly obsessed with IP. So I'm curious, from your guys' perspective, how challenging is it, from your guys' perspective, to get original genre or sci-fi made right now? Like, everyone wants the next Lost as opposed to, just trying to find like their own thing.
Yeah, I mean, like the simple answer to your question is if someone wants the next Lost, what they're actually saying is we want something kind of original, that like when Lost basically came along, it didn't reinvent the wheel, right? It was an amalgam of a lot of things that influenced us. JJ and I, and certainly Carlton, saw it very much in the tradition of Twin Peaks and The X-Files as an ongoing serialized mythological series. And Ron was obviously doing the same thing on Battlestar concurrently, which is they were heavily serialized at a time in the early 2000s where, sort of procedurals were kind of like the buzzword, where it was like people want shows beginning, middle, and end. And there was like this very popular theory in the business where that if someone considered themselves like a real devoted fan of a show, they only watch like one out of every 3 episodes. So if you were doing like cliffhangers or really intricate plotting from episode to episode, you would lose the audience. And we were like, well, we don't really have that option on a show like Lost. Like, right. There's no ringing phone. There's no like franchise of like a cop show or a doctor show or a lawyer show. So we have to do it this way. We don't really have any choice. And Desperate Housewives was doing the same thing, heavily serialized, same year. And it was just sort of like they just did the opposite of what the popular thinking was at the time. And now you think, now we're in the year 2020 and you're like, what are the shows that cut through? Like, are they procedurals or are they heavily serialized and bingeable? And so that idea of like people want a rich experience, and because at the time of DVRs or season-long DVDs where you could binge, and now because of streaming, you can watch these shows at your own pace. And so that model of storytelling is much more satisfying. And so the reality is like people say we want pre-existing IP as a way of saying that helps our marketing department sell a show, but it is the Queen's Gambit, which is the show, in my opinion, that is cutting through right now, not just in terms of viewership, but also culturally. Is that pre-existing IP? Like it is not. And a show like For All Mankind, it's people know Ron, right? Like, but like it is original, I mean, it's sort of like people don't hear that title and go like, oh, that's based on a thing that I know intimately, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like pre-existing IP. Is it a book like you and I we would probably all consider like Gibson, like Cyberpunk, like Neuromancer, that's pre-existing IP. But if you put a poster on Sunset Boulevard for the show Neuromancer, like 1 out of every 100,000 people understands that that's a thing that existed before the show existed. So if you're out of like the Marvel verse, or Star Wars or, Harry Potter, kind of like the big major popular cultural phenoms, I think that the job remains like make a really good show, but it's hard for us it's hard for us to say what the challenges are, because if Ron and I are out in the world pitching a show, it's like a Ron show or a Damon show, and that helps, like, that gives us a little bit more latitude than we would have had 15 years ago at the beginning of our careers. You know, like, I think that it probably would have been challenging. But at the same time, like, Stranger Things isn't pre-existing IP, you know,
Right.
and it's massively successful.
It's like you said, it's the marketing thing. It's like they have the marketing thing in their ears about it's a title and people have heard about it. Oh, now we can sell it. Because that's what Battlestar was. Battlestar, they wanted someone to come in and do it, redo it, not because they thought there was something great in it, but just because they were like, people remember the name Battlestar Galactica. They don't even know what it means. They didn't know anything about the show. It didn't matter. And they didn't really care what they did with it because they just literally said, we know we can sell it. Just do something with it that you think is great, and we can put that on it and sell it because it's a recognizable name. And it's just like the path of least resistance in a lot of executive suites of, oh, it has a name and someone's heard of that name. Great. It's like people will buy books because of the cover. You know, it's that kind of it's about that deep sometimes.
Sorry about that, guys. My thing froze again.
No worry.
Before it does it again, I'm just going to kick over to some. We got a lot of viewer Q&As coming in. Damon, obviously, everyone's a big fan of Watchmen. The question is, did the story always start out as contained for you, or were there other avenues you went down that didn't pan out?
The question was it always contained?
Always planned to be like a closed-ended story, like a one and done.
Yes. Yes is the answer. I mean, the original Watchmen, upon which our Watchmen was based, 12 issues written by Alan Moore, illustrated by Dave Gibbons, was designed to have a beginning, middle, and end. And Alan Moore was very specific about saying that's all there's going to be. And it doesn't matter that this is being lauded as highly successful or one of the greatest pieces of comics writing, let alone writing of all time. I don't want to do anymore. And so part of me is like, well, if I'm going to ignore him or defy him, like at the very least, I should honor that initial instinct and make it close-ended. One of the things that makes it Watchmen is not that like season 1 ends with the big cliffhanger and then it just goes on. And the other thing is, I was becoming very enamored of shows like Fargo, you know, where like, or True Detective, where you do a season, resolve the character arcs and whatever the underlying mystery is, and then you can do another season and it's still called True Detective or Fargo, but you can completely and totally recast it. It can be set in a different time period, like, and it still has the same tonal frequencies as Watchmen. So I was very clear with HBO that it was good. I only wanted to make one season of it. And I think that they were sort of like, this is what Damon does after, you know, because that's the way that I did on Leftovers, was always like, we're going to have, each season's going to be close ended. And then we'll see if there's going to be another one. They're like, he'll change his mind. But then as we were getting into it, I just became more and more explicit. This is all I'm doing. But I still believe that there should be more Watchmen, but it would be really cool if somebody else did it. Because again, you know, I grew up in a comic book culture where people create characters, but then other writers and artists would come in and do runs on those characters. So like Chris Claremont didn't invent the X-Men, but he has like the definitive X-Men run of certainly like my early childhood. And, you know, and now Hickman has come in, Jonathan Hickman, and done a great X-Men run. And so that idea of saying like, you know, Ta-Nehisi Coates and Ryan Coogler can both do Black Panther stories, you know, and the Black Panther is bigger than any one writer. And I feel that way. I feel like the way to keep Watchmen interesting is to basically come in, you do your album, and then you step away. And that's how it was designed.
And this question is from the vice chair of the Latino Writers Committee at the WGA for both of you. What advice do you have for BIPOC writers, genre writers, who find themselves only being put up to write BIPOC-based shows when they want to be seen as genre writers who write for universal genre shows?
That's hard because there's certainly a tendency in the business to just pigeonhole you into whatever you did, and that's all you can do, and they just want you to keep going down that line, and it's hard to break out of that. When I came out of Star Trek, I had been there for 10 years and had written all these episodes, and left the show, and then was trying to get other gigs. And my agent at the time, I remember him saying, "You should probably spec out a couple other shows." Like, what do you mean spec out? And he said, "Well, no one will read a Star Trek script. And right now, in everyone's head in town, you're just a Star Trek writer and you can't do anything else." And I was really kind of taken aback, like, what? Seriously? And he said, "No, really. I mean, it's science fiction and it's Star Trek. So you're in a hole of a hole. Like, no one is going to look at anything." And you would think that attitude would change. But when I did Outlander, I to this day, I'll get questions about, it's so unusual. How could you do a show like Outlander? It's not in space, like, really? And so there's just this perception that, if you dabble in genre, that's it. And I have to believe, though, it's probably larger than genre. I imagine if you're a comedy writer, people don't think you can write anything other than comedy. Or if you're 1 hour, you probably aren't welcome, pitching half hours. And there's just a tendency overall to just push everybody into that lane of whatever they've been doing. And I guess I don't know what the advice is how to break out of that, except you just got to try. You just got to refuse to accept that. If you want to do a project that's outside of the genre that you've been in, you just got to push and push and push and know that you're just walking into resistance, that people just don't think that way.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that I want to say is I just want to acknowledge the legitimacy of that question as a very real thing in our business. I think, obviously we're in the midst of a long overdue reckoning that started way too late, but I have been privy to and participating in a number of conversations, since the summer, where these I think that question would have been dealt with in a way of that's not a real thing. I'm not even validating it. It just is. If you are a BIPOC writer, the conventional thinking, particularly in terms of sci-fi, is sci-fi writers look like this. They're white nerdy dudes, and there is some space for white nerdy women. But even and so that's the conventional thinking. When anybody who's been part of fandom as long as Ron and I have know that if you're down in San Diego, we come in all shapes, sizes, and colors, etc. But I think that idea of if I'm going to hire a Latinx writer on my show, that means that there has to be a Latinx character. It has to be about the Latinx experience versus this human being happens to be interested in time travel. And their cultural background is completely and totally irrelevant to their competency to work on the show. And so I think that the larger issue is that showrunners and people in positions of hiring become more cognitive of our own, I don't want to throw out these sort of virtue signaling buzzwords, but they're true, of our own sort of cultural biases and tribalism in terms of saying oh, we're much more comfortable hanging out in rooms full of white dudes because we're white dudes. And the reason that we feel that way is we're not going to say anything that upsets anybody or offends anybody. We just have to move past that and say just don't fucking say anything offensive. You can get beyond it. And I know that Ron has worked with incredibly diverse staffs, as have I, and the shows are better for it. And so I think that you're not doing anything wrong. The challenge is not yours. The challenge is the industries and the agencies. Not to always make them the heel here, but I do think that part of just starting to curate more BIPOC talent so that in a decade a writer's room just looks different than it did a decade ago is what we're all striving towards. I know that all
I
feels
don't.
magical, but
I also just want to say and acknowledge everything that Damon said is correct, and also that you digitized partially through the question, and I misunderstood the question. I thought it was about you were asking about writers who are working in genre material having trouble getting out of a genre. So I didn't hear the
Oh,
BIPOC part
sorry.
of it, and so Damon's answer is much more full and correct than I was talking about something completely different.
I think it is. But there is interesting symmetry there, even though it happened accidentally, which is, writers. I, I'm very
Yeah.
proud of the fact that Nash Bridges was my first gig. And then my second gig, I spent 3 years on a show called Crossing Jordan, which I'm also proud of. And it was a procedural about a medical examiner. And the guy who ran that show, Tim Krang, he went on to create Heroes, which is a total genre show. And so that idea of oh, this is what you're good at. This is what you know. Is the industry wants to put us in a box, and it's our job to basically acknowledge the box that we're in, and we can either accept that designation or do everything we can to punch our way out of it. But understanding that as a white male, it's much easier to punch your way out of the box than it is if you are a woman or a member of the BIPOC community. We have to just say that is true, if we're going to do anything to change it.
Very well said, man. In terms of staffing for shows for lower level or mid-level writers, what suggestions do you have for how they can find success when it comes to pitching ideas in the room?
Well, I always just say in the room. I always give this speech at the beginning of a show that, the way I was brought up in the business was that the showrunner in a writer's room is the first among equals, and that as we're in the room, everyone needs to participate, and that my job is to kind of pull the best idea out of the room. So I'm always trying to encourage everybody, no matter what their level is, no matter if is their first show or they've run shows in the past and they're working with us together, that you're really trying to encourage everyone to pull together and to not be afraid to just pitch, to just throw the ideas. No bad ideas. It's like things we may not do and things that might not work. There's no stupid ideas, and you just have to try to inculcate this sense of teamwork, and that television is a team sport. We're all in here. We're all trying to make the best show that we can up on the board, and it is definitely intimidating for younger writers or new writers that come in for the first time, and they do tend to hang back. And you try to encourage it. You try to in the pre-Zoom era, you would try to look over to them and throw a question to them, or ask them what they thought, or show them that you're interested in what their ideas are. So as the showrunner, it's kind of your responsibility to try to get that, to kind of foster that kind of culture. When you're the young writer or the new writer on staff, I think you just have to be brave, and you have to step forward and try to get your idea out there, try to pitch, and try not to be afraid that you're going to get shot down. And if you do get shot down, pitch out another idea, because it's that kind of that persistence that ultimately pays off and gets you, where you're trying to go.
I agree with everything that Ron said, and the one addendum that I would say is there are definitely bad ideas, and many of them come from me, but there is honor in being the bad idea. The way that I see it is the place that we're trying to get to is behind a huge castle wall, and the only way over the wall is to make bodies, dead corpses, pile up on the outside of the wall so that we can climb those corpses and get over the top. And those bodies are your ideas. And so the reality is every idea has value, because one of the things that would always frustrate me is if something great happened on Lost or The Leftovers or Watchmen, I would be asked by the press, whose idea was that? And you kind of go well, the idea as presented to you in the television show was actually this writer, but they just sat there for 20 minutes while the rest of us threw our bodies into the wall, and they were able to kind of see what not to do. You are iterating. I mean, Ron is doing a show about NASA, and so that idea of there have to be all these failures and in order to have the success. And nobody wants to be the failure. And that's, like, that's my speech, which is like, not don't be afraid of failure. I mean, we are afraid of failure. We're wired to not want to fail. Everybody wants to succeed all the time. However, like, you have to embrace failure. It's, it's the Yoda Luke conversation in episode 8, which again, the fandom is very divided about, episode 8. Is it great or is it the worst? Like, I mean, I love episode 8 personally, and particularly that conversation, because that's the Yoda that I met in Empire, not the Yoda who's very serious in the prequels, who can do flips and wields a lightsaber and has no sense of humor whatsoever.
Right.
Like, I want a little wise ass, who's like just as likely to steal your candy bar as he is an X-Wing out of Dagobah. But what Yoda says is, like, you're gonna fail, buddy. Like, and that's what I say is, there is honor in pitching the terrible ideas. They are required to find the good ones.
That's good to keep the room a safe space. In terms of that,
it's not a safe space at all. It's brutal. Like, let's be clear about that. Like, I mean, it's safe in the way that we want it to be safe, but it is. Right. It's also the Thunderdome. Like,
it is a bit of Thunderdome.
Yeah.
In terms of that, when you see like a writer, maybe struggling and trying to, not knowing exactly the politics, the dynamics of the room yet, like, what steps do you take to help mentor them or encourage them to, get over that hump?
You digitized on me there again. You were asking about.
If he's still digitizing, it's basically, if you see someone struggling in the room, particularly like sort of a younger writer who's maybe having first room experience, like, do you intervene? How do you mentor them? Like, what's the, how do you engage?
I think what I've done is, in the past is, if I've seen that happen, I've usually met with them privately and talked and said, hey, how's it going? And, and saw that maybe you were having a difficult time or felt bad about, that your idea got shut down. I usually just try to talk to them and again, encourage them to not let that be a problem. I have had situations where I've been in writers' rooms where rooms were split, which I hated. Like, I've only experienced that once or twice, but rooms where you literally had factions. These writers hate these writers. And that's a different dynamic. That's tough. And then you get into, like, therapy sessions with individual writers and trying to, why do you have such a problem with him or her? And, can't we all get along? And I could never resolve that. Like, once you get into that place, I found my skill set was sort of failed me, and I couldn't heal the divisions in the room. But when it's just a case of someone who's personally struggling or personally can't seem to get their feet under them, I find that, you just try to talk to them one-on-one and try to say, hey, my door's always open, or, if you're same thing, if you're struggling with the script, let me know and let's talk. Or I might find somebody that they paired with really well in the room, like you and so-and-so get along really well, and I might talk to that more experienced writer to try to talk to them and take them aside and, see how they're doing. So it's a lot of management and just people management and trying to figure out ways to get them back on board the team.
I'm not going to be able to do better than that.
Okay. Sam Christopher asks, you both have written pilots that introduce us to a significant amount of world building in a very limited amount of time. So what is your approach to bringing the audience into a world that feels fully lived in without overwhelming them?
Well, I think, like, implicit in the question is the biggest trap door or quicksand that you don't want to step into, which is don't show off all the world building in the pilot. The pilot, at least my philosophy is that all the world building is just a delivery system to create it, like, a way for you to care about at least one or hopefully several of the characters. And I think that there are pilots that are basically like, they're so impressed with, we need to explain to you all the intricacies of this world, that they forget that the show lives down here on the ground, and they're up at 30,000 feet explaining all of these things, and you just have to be patient and essentially say there's time to kind of build out the world as we go. But all the pilot needs to do is make you, like, on a potato chip level, make you want to go eat another one. But
Right.
but on a storytelling level, it's just like get you interested and emotionally invested and engaged and connected with the characters. And I think that what, like both the Lost pilot and, I don't know if you consider the Battlestar miniseries or 33 as the pilot, depending on but what they both, like, the miniseries is much more of a conventional, like, we're setting up this series of this scenario by which this flotilla is now on the run. But 33 is like, that's my kind of pilot, where you're kind of like, what the fuck? They're like, they got a jump or they're dead. And this guy, I like this guy. What's his name? Oh, he's that guy's dad. Like, that's you care about the people. I mean, people keep saying character, and it seems rote, but like, I just can't stress it enough. So many shows came along where it's basically like, oh yeah, we figured out like 3 seasons worth of this show. The world building is so intricate, and is like, yeah, but I don't give a shit about anyone in it. Like, focus on the people. And I know, easy for me to say, hoisted by my own petard, like, then then you're not focused as much on the mythology. But if you have to pick one, pick character. Like,
yeah, because that's what people remember, and that's what they really care about. That's why they come back to the show. It's not to see the next interesting development of the plot, in my opinion. It's because they're invested in these characters, and they want to see what happens to these characters next week. It's really all about that. You're invested in Kirk and Spock, or you're invested in Adama, or you're invested in whoever. It's like, it's those people that you're caught up with and you're fascinated with, and the plot services the characters, really.
1,000%.
Piggybacking off that, Jared asks, one of the best character moments in the Lost pilot is the angel hair pasta scene between Kate and Jack. Damon, can you talk about how you guys came about to that scene?
JJ had some friend who was a spinal surgeon who like, when we were talking about the fact that we wanted our hero, traditionally your hero is like a cop, or like a like a military guy, like, who's, like, you basically go like, who's the person that you want to be the lead on the desert island show. And then we were both sort of enamored of the fact that this guy wakes up in the jungle and he's got medical expertise. The guy isn't going to be a fighter, but he's going to be a healer. And so I can't remember how organically this came along, but it's like, we want him to get wounded and he has to talk someone else through stitching him up. So he's the doctor, but he can't perform. The injury is on his back, and so he can't get to it. And so this would be a way to bond the two characters, in this case, Jack and Kate. And then we were like, wow, it actually takes quite a long time to sew somebody up. And even when you're compressing for television time, it's this is going to be a very, they got to be talking to each other for like a good 3 minutes, because we wanted there to be some degree of authenticity and veracity to the show. Things take the time they take. If they're going to build a raft, it's going to take them 5 episodes to do it. Like, and so it was sort of like, so he needs to tell her a story while she's sewing him up, and what should that story be? And then JJ just said, like, oh, I have this buddy who's a spinal surgeon, and he said that he opened up someone's back and all the nerves were like, vermicelli with like angel hair pasta, and that, he just wrote it. Like, I literally, awesome. in the way that pilot was written, because we were strangers, we were not dance partners. Who, like, it was more like Dancing with the Stars, where it's just like, you, Damon, you're Carol Baskin, you've never danced before, This is J.J. Abrams. He is a professional genre storyteller. You will be dancing together. He would write a scene. I would write a scene. He would write a scene. I would write a scene. And I wasn't rewriting any of J.J.'s scenes.
Right. Thank you for answering that. This question is for both of you. What are some of your favorite genre writers working right now or that have been working? Favorite female genre writers, excuse me.
I love Melissa Rosenberg. Did you hear? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh,
I hear you now. You're kind of freezing, but
Melissa Rosenberg.
yeah.
She Jessica Jones, an incredible show. I mean, isn't every female writer a genre writer? But you mean like sort of in the space of
in the sci-fi? I believe that they're asking in the sci-fi horror action space.
Yeah, I mean, she's the one that immediately jumps into my brain pan, you know. But I love Courtney Kemp too, who wrote for Power, which is a great crime writes for Power and all its spinoffs. It's a great crime show, and obviously Liz Sarnoff, who I've worked with directly and mentioned, I feel flummoxed to name more, but I promise to come up with them as Ron talks.
Okay.
Oh, thanks. It's funny. I don't read a lot in the science fiction and fantasy genre anymore. Once I got into it professionally, it's almost like my brain stopped wanting to consume it on any kind of fun level or fan level. So I read almost exclusively biography and history now. But like the ones that I remember that I enjoyed the most were like Diane Duane, Melinda Snodgrass, who I also worked with on Star Trek briefly, Anne McCaffrey, who did Dragon Riders of Pern, which was a seminal work that I really, really enjoyed. And those are like the three that popped to mind of who I used to read.
I'm a big Jane Espenson fan too. Classic.
Yeah, Jane Espenson, who I also worked with, was fantastic.
Great. Damon, Max Perry has a Watchmen question for you.
Oh boy.
He's curious if there was more planned for Lady True in the final episodes. It felt like there might have been more with her that was edited away.
It wasn't. We didn't shoot anything, but there was originally in the episodic design an entire Lady True episode that started with her childhood in Saigon, and showed her being raised by her mom, and was like kind of structured as an entire episode from her point of view, like catching her up to the present moment. And what we found was that we did the 5th episode, which was a Looking Glass episode, focused solely on the Tim Blake Nelson character, and then the 6th episode was Angela's nostalgia experience, which goes back in time, is the black and white episode, This Extraordinary Being, which was an episode that it was an Angela episode, but as through her grandfather's eyes. And so we came into the 7th episode feeling like we needed to be in the present, and firmly routed in Angela's experience. And so it was sort of like the show felt like we were going forwards, going back, going forwards, going back. And now that we were in that final end run of episodes, the show was telling us, you are very close to the end now. It is very indulgent to go back and do the Lady True episode. But I'd be lying if I didn't say that we all sort of had collective regrets that we didn't try harder to pull it off, because Hung Chau is such an incredible actor. And I think that the audience would have indulged. They would have, it's like the judge in one of those courtroom dramas who's like, I'll allow it, counselor, but careful, we had worked out the entire episode. We just never wrote it or shot it. Yeah.
Did you write the script for it?
No, we never broke it.
Wow, nice. In terms of this question for both of you, what is something about the notes process that you are aware of now, but you wish you knew more of when you were starting out?
I think it's just the experience of knowing, what a hill to die on is. What are the notes you got to
Right.
fight, and because they are just going to be devastating and destroy the piece, versus the ones you don't like but you can probably work with, and everything in between. Because at the beginning, at least for me, the tendency was to fight every note. I didn't want to take the notes, and I didn't like the notes, and sometimes I didn't respect who was giving me the note, which made it even worse. And over time, you start to realize sometimes they're just giving you the note and they don't even really care if you do it. And sometimes they're giving you a note and they don't realize how devastating this note is if you were to take it seriously and do the thing that they're actually asking you to do, and it would just blow up the whole piece. And you find ways of giving them what they really want, not what they said they want, but what's the note, the classic is what's the note behind the note? What are they actually trying to get to? And that's a hard thing to learn. And it's like you just have to go, I think you just have to go through it so many times. You start picking up on the subtleties of it and ways of reading what they're trying to tell you, and not falling into the trap of just making it, all out trench war from the beginning. There's times when you got to do it. There's times when the battle lines are drawn and you're just going to fight this one to the death. But you can't do that on every script especially not at every note. And knowing the difference that's the most valuable thing I know now that I wish I had known, many years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I've never liked the word notes because it doesn't feel accurate when you're receiving them. Like when I was in high school and someone like gave you a note, it was like, ooh, like, like, and it's like there's a notes call set for 4:00. Nobody's like, great, like,
Great. Yeah.
So I think that I look at notes as thoughts. That's the way that I choose to receive them. And so people are sharing their thoughts. If you look at it as criticisms, then you will be in a combative modality, sort of like as Ron suggested. But it's like someone's just sharing their thoughts with you, and there's validity to anyone's thoughts. Like, you may disagree with someone about any number of things, but you can't say they're not thinking what they're thinking. And so if you're trying to create a broader sense of connection and understanding and clarity, you have to assign that intention to the person who's giving you the notes and proceed accordingly. And I can't believe that I forgot this name, but Misha Green. Misha Green is one of the best females writing genre right now. Lovecraft was amazing. But she also wrote Underground, which probably wouldn't be considered genre because it doesn't have sci-fi fantasy elements, but extraordinary.
Yeah, Misha was great. She worked on Helix, which I was part of too.
Yeah.
She's fantastic.
Yeah.
And we're coming toward the end here.
Oh.
We're coming towards the end.
We're coming towards the end is all I heard, so.
I guess we should probably moderate the questions ourselves.
We're coming towards the end, and Damon, we'd like you to go on a 5-minute monologue about the following subject.
Oh my God. Just freestyle.
Just freestyle. Jazz exploration.
Oh, he's back.
Oh, he's back. There he is.
All right, Phil, spit it out before you freeze up again. And he's frozen again. Let's see.
It's hard because we could vamp, but I'm sure there's some final question he wants to ask.
Yeah, I feel. Well, I mean, I guess if I were on this panel, what I would want to know from you is like, what are you watching right now? Like, can you give me a Christmas, a holiday? Sorry, I can't say Christmas or on Christmas. Holiday recommendation.
I was very late to the party, but it's still worth saying that I thought Schitt's Creek was amazing. Like I finally binged the whole thing with my wife in the last couple of weeks, and I just wondered what this was all about, and finally sat down and watched it, and it was really impressed and touched, and what a positive, heartwarming, and genuinely funny and well-written show it is. So that I'm impressed with. And then right after that, I watched Ted Lasso, which was also like positive, interesting, and just love the fact that now we're moving into that kind of programming is coming, and there can be, not everything has to be dystopian. I love dystopian too, but at a certain point, especially in the current world, it's great to see some things that make you smile and that touch your heart. And those two shows I highly recommend.
We need some utopia for sure.
Yeah.
Well, guys, that's all we have. Thank you so much for being generous with your time, and you gave some great answers tonight. And I hope it was helpful for those watching at home. Please be safe over the holiday season and enjoy the holiday. And Ron, Damon, again, thank you very much.
Thank
Absolutely.
you.
Thank you. Great to
Everybody
be here.
stay safe. Live long and prosper.
Take care. Live long and prosper.